Welcome to Before the Footnotes. Here we tell the stories that sit underneath the clean, polished version of history. The part that gets smoothed out once an outcome looks inevitable. We follow the forgotten drafts, the half-decisions, the compromises, the people who lost leverage. We're not chasing the final object on the shelf. We're chasing the messy path that made that shelf possible. In today's video, we follow one of the deepest transformations of the 20th century, the rise of the shipping container. It's easy to treat the container as a simple upgrade, a smarter box, a faster crane, a modern port. The story that sits before the footnotes is rougher. For a long time, the container looked like a niche trick. It threatened jobs, broke routines, demanded new infrastructure, and forced cities and institutions into choices they didn't want to make. By the end, it had rewritten the map of global trade so thoroughly that it became hard to remember the world it replaced. For centuries, global trade moved at the speed of human hands. Before containers, every object that crossed an ocean had to be touched, lifted, carried, stacked, counted, and repositioned again and again. Maritime shipping existed and mattered, yet it lived inside a permanent bottleneck. The limit wasn't the Atlantic or the Pacific. The limit was the dock. Until the mid-20th century, almost all cargo moved through what was called the breakbulk system: wooden crates, barrels, burlap sacks, textile bales, loose metal parts, each shipment shaped like its own problem. When a ship arrived, the port turned into a long choreography of waiting and muscle. Trucks unloaded at the quay. Cargo sat in warehouses. Nets and hooks carried it into the hold. If the weight distribution came out wrong, crews and dock workers had to rearrange the entire puzzle. Shipping wasn't a single process. It was a chain of repeated handling. That repetition produced a world that feels alien now. A ship might cross the Atlantic in roughly 10 days and still spend weeks stationary while being loaded and unloaded. In some places, time at berth could swallow more than half the total door-to-door journey. Ocean navigation improved faster than ports could modernize. The sea became faster, the shoreline stayed slow. Each touch had consequences. Every transfer created a chance for damage, water exposure, theft, and paperwork disputes. Insurance rose. Schedules became estimates rather than plans. Certain goods could justify that uncertainty. Many could not. International trade existed, yet it filtered what was worth the trouble. Logistics wasn't just moving the world's economy. It was quietly deciding which parts of that economy were even practical. Ports themselves looked like crowded industrial cities jammed inside larger cities. Rail tracks crossed streets. Warehouses stood wall to wall. Thousands of dock workers depended on physical strength and improvisation under constant pressure. Expanding meant taking more urban space, hiring more people, and accepting more congestion. There was a hard ceiling on speed because the system was built around manual handling. After World War II, that ceiling started to matter in a new way. European reconstruction increased volumes. American industrial output rose. Consumption surged. Manufacturing learned how to scale. Shipping at the dock still behaved like it belonged to another century. Ships became larger and engines more efficient, while the bottleneck stayed lodged in the transshipment. The slow, repetitive moment when goods were forced to change hands and change form. People inside the industry could see the arithmetic. Moving loose cargo cost dollars per ton in handling alone. Port time represented a large share of the total shipping cost. A delay in a congested terminal didn't stay local. It rippled outward through warehouses, rail schedules, and factory timelines. A strike or a storm didn't just slow a ship. It jammed an entire corridor of commerce. That's the environment where a simple idea began to grow. one that didn't come out of a grand theory about world trade. It came from watching a daily absurdity. Malcolm McLean, a trucking entrepreneur, saw trucks arrive with cargo already organized inside a trailer. The waste appeared when everything had to be broken down, simply so it could be rebuilt in the ship's hold. His question wasn't philosophical. It was brutally practical. Why not move the box as a unit and leave the contents alone? In April 1956, the question became a trial. A converted tanker left Newark for Houston, carrying 58 metal boxes stacked on deck. The number seems small because history is cruel that way. Early turning points often look modest in hindsight. The impact was immediate in the places that mattered most: cost sheets and operating time. Handling costs per ton dropped dramatically. Port time collapsed. The labor required to move a given volume fell. The dock stopped being the center of the operation. The flow of standardized units started to replace the old choreography of individual items. Here's where the before the footnotes story matters. This was not a world that instantly embraced the container as destiny. Ports weren't built for it. Cities didn't want to carve out enormous yards. Unions didn't want to sign away leverage. Shipping lines didn't want to buy specialized ships. Investors didn't want to bankroll expensive infrastructure for a system that still looked unproven outside a few routes. For years, containerization lived alongside breakbulk in an uneasy coexistence, and the future remained negotiable. The container only became a true system once it became a shared language. Through the 1960s, dimensions and fittings were standardized under international norms. That standardization gave the industry something it had never fully possessed: interoperability. The same box could move from the truck to rail to ship without being translated at each handoff. A unit emerged that organized the entire conversation: the TEU, the 20-foot equivalent unit. Ships began to be described by how many TEUs they could carry. Ports began to measure their capacity by TEUs moved per year. Trade acquired a single yardstick. Once that yardstick existed, the world started changing in ways that were felt on streets and paychecks as much as in boardrooms. Port geography shifted. Container operations demanded enormous flat yards, deep berths, heavy cranes, and clean connections to highways and rail. Older ports, squeezed into dense city centers, discovered their physical limits. Some tried to expand and ran into politics, real estate, and public resistance. Others moved outward, leaving behind neighborhoods shaped by older waterfront labor. A port that modernized quickly could become a hub. A port that hesitated could lose relevance for decades. The human dimension didn't vanish. It moved. Breakbulk had relied on large numbers of dock workers and slow, skill-heavy routines. Container terminals required fewer hands and more machines, plus a new layer of scheduling, maintenance, and control. For some workers, that meant retraining. For others, it meant displacement. The container didn't just reorganize cargo, it reorganized bargaining power, local economies, and the meaning of a port city's identity. By the 1970s, container ships designed for standardized boxes were carrying hundreds of units per voyage. That concentration changed the nature of risk. A planning error no longer affected a handful of crates. It could affect hundreds of containers at once. Companies felt the impact immediately. Predictable transit made it possible to reduce inventories. Goods didn't need to sit for as long in warehouses once shipping became a timed sequence. Production and distribution moved closer together in time, even as they spread farther apart in space. Distance stopped being the decisive barrier when ocean crossings could be scheduled and scaled. At this point, containerization became infrastructure, the kind of infrastructure that disappears into the background once it works. By the end of this phase, global trade operated at a different cadence. Ports became nodes of passage rather than places of waiting. Ships stopped behaving like floating warehouses and started behaving like timed links in a chain. As the system matured, it did what successful systems do. It demanded scale. Through the 1980s and beyond, containers became the dominant way manufactured goods moved across oceans, commonly described as around 90% of manufactured cargo being containerized. The largest ships grew into floating mountains of steel boxes. Today, the biggest vessels carry more than 24,000 TEUs in a single voyage. Each crossing concentrates a volume that would have required fleets a few decades earlier. That scale produced numbers that feel almost like a prank. A single 20-foot container can hold thousands upon thousands of small consumer items. Spread the cost of fuel and crew across that volume, and transport cost per unit can fall to pennies on major routes. The modern world learns an unsettling lesson. The price of distance can become smaller than the price of time. That's where supply chains fracture and stretch. A component can be made in one country, assembled in another, packaged in a third, sold in a fourth. Ports turn into global hubs where enormous volumes funnel through a handful of strategic points. Shipping firms consolidate. Fewer players control more routes. Fewer terminals sustain more trade. Efficiency rises alongside concentration. And then another layer of the story reveals itself. A system built for synchronized movement develops thinner margins for improvisation. Inventory shrinks. Time becomes the central variable. Everything depends on windows, schedules, and coordination. A late container isn't just a box arriving after a deadline. It can break a sequence planned weeks in advance. The disruption doesn't need to be dramatic to matter. A delay in a canal, congestion in a major terminal, a localized interruption. The effect spreads outward as containers pile up in the wrong place and ships miss their slots. What makes this era distinctive is how the system absorbs shock. Store shelves often don't empty overnight. The first impacts appear backstage. Renegotiated contracts, absorbed costs, extended lead times, factories slowing because a single component is stuck in the wrong queue. Modern logistics rarely collapses like a building. It loses cadence like a machine, with timing off by a few degrees. The footnotes tend to summarize this transformation as efficiency and globalization, as if it were a clean technical evolution. The story before the footnotes has a different shape. It's a story where a simple steel box forced cities to rebuild waterfronts, forced industries to standardize, forced labor to renegotiate its place, and forced the world to accept a new relationship with time. The container was designed to eliminate idle hours at the dock. It ended up teaching the planet how to live on a continuous rhythm. Today, when something crosses oceans with an efficiency that feels ordinary, it happens because the world learned to revolve around a silent unit that most people never think about. While the flow holds, it stays invisible. When it slows, the outline of the system becomes visible again. And the inevitable story starts to look, for a moment, like what it really was. A long chain of choices that could have turned out differently. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is for. If you want more stories that live in the gap between what happened and how it actually became possible, leave a like and subscribe to Before the Footnotes. And tell me in the comments, what everyday system do you think people only notice when it fails? Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.